They told you Constantinople was doomed, that its fall was inevitable. But they never told you what it felt like. The smell of burning flesh drifting through the narrow alleys, the echo of prayers clashing against the roar of cannons, and the silence that came when hope finally broke. Close your eyes for a second. Imagine the last night before the end, the moon hanging blood-red over the Theodosian walls, the tired defenders, priests, nobles, and peasants alike, clutching rusted swords and crosses, whispering prayers to a god who no longer seemed to listen. Outside the walls, tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers waited in silence, their torches flickering like stars devouring the horizon. The ground trembled under the weight of their cannons, the largest the world had ever seen. But what if I told you that the fall of Constantinople was not just a military conquest, but a calculated act of psychological annihilation? That the siege wasn't only meant to destroy a city, but to erase a civilization, its faith, its legacy, its identity, from the face of the earth? The story begins long before the walls fell. It begins with a prophecy, a whisper that the city blessed by God could never fall to infidels. And yet, in 1453, prophecy met iron and fire. Every blow of the Ottoman cannon wasn't just an explosion of stone, it was a challenge to divine destiny itself. As dawn broke over the Bosporus, the defenders saw their faith tested like never before. Their emperor, Constantine V, refused to flee. He stood among his men, his armor shimmering beneath the rising sun, his voice trembling not with fear but with fury. "We fight," he said, "for God, for faith, and for the city of our fathers." Those words would be his last command, and his epitaph. This wasn't just the end of Byzantium, it was the death of the ancient world. The gateway between East and West was about to be swallowed by gunpowder, blood, and destiny. And yet, the true horror of what happened next is far darker than any history book dares to tell. Before we dive deeper into the nightmare of Constantinople's final days, the starvation, the betrayal, the unspeakable atrocities, tell me, would you have fought until the last breath or fled before the storm? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you want to uncover the secrets that history tried to bury, don't forget to like this video and subscribe, because what comes next will haunt you. By the mid-15th century, the Byzantine Empire was a ghost clinging to its own shadow. Once it had ruled from the shores of Spain to the sands of Syria, now it was a single city surrounded by enemies and forgotten by allies. Constantinople, once the radiant heart of Christendom, had become a relic of another age. Its marble columns cracked, its palaces empty, and its treasury little more than dust and memory. The city stood proud, yet hollow. Within its walls, the echoes of hymns once sung by emperors now faded into desperate prayers of survival. The mosaics of saints glimmered faintly in the candlelight, their golden faces watching silently as famine gnawed at the people below. The streets that had once seen the triumphal processions of Justinian and Basil were now crowded with beggars, monks, and weary soldiers who knew that every sunrise might be their last. The Byzantine court was divided, its nobles more interested in intrigue than defense. Debates raged over union with the Roman Church, a desperate attempt to gain Western support, but pride and centuries of schism poisoned every negotiation. The Pope had promised help, yet what arrived were only a few ships, a handful of mercenaries, and hollow words of faith. The West had moved on. The Crusaders of old were now merchants counting their gold in Venice and Genoa, their eyes fixed on profit, not salvation. And so, the empire waited. Emperor Constantine V, Palaeologus, ruled over a corpse that still breathed. He walked through Hagia Sophia not as a sovereign but as a man mourning his inheritance. Yet he refused to surrender. "As long as one man stands upon these walls," he said, "Constantinople shall not fall." Those who heard him believed, if only because believing was all they had left. Outside the city, the Ottoman Empire was no longer a rising power. It was an unstoppable storm. Sultan Mehmed II, barely 21, had inherited not just a throne but a vision to crush the last remnant of Rome and to make himself master of two worlds, East and West. To him, Constantinople was not merely a city, it was destiny. But destiny alone could not conquer stone and faith. Even as supplies dwindled and morale faltered, the defenders refused to yield. They repaired the ancient walls with whatever they could find: stones, timber, even broken statues from the ruins of their past. Women and children carried buckets of water to the battlements while priests walked among the soldiers, offering blessings to men who knew they were already dead. Night after night, the sound of Ottoman drums thundered beyond the walls, a rhythm of death and inevitability. Yet from within, the city answered with the toll of church bells, their chimes rising defiantly against the darkness. It was a fragile defiance, yes, but one born not of hope, but of sheer unyielding pride. Because Constantinople might have been broken, but it would not kneel. Not yet. For 1,000 years, the Theodosian walls had stood unbroken, a crown of stone encircling, the queen of cities. They had defied Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and countless armies that came and shattered themselves against their might. The people of Constantinople believed the walls were blessed by heaven itself. To fall behind them was to stand in the hand of God. But in 1453, even God seemed to falter. The triple line of walls, a marvel of engineering and faith, stretched nearly 7 kilometers, with towers rising like sentinels above the Golden Horn. The moat was deep, the gates fortified, and the outer wall bristled with defenders. Each layer had once been a promise of immortality. Now, under the eyes of Sultan Mehmed II, it was an ancient monument facing a new age of destruction. The Ottomans brought something the Byzantines had never seen before, a weapon so monstrous it seemed born from the underworld itself. Its name was Basilica, a massive cannon forged by the Hungarian engineer Urban. Cast in bronze and weighing over 18 tons, it could fire a stone ball the size of a man's chest more than a mile. When it roared, the ground shook like thunder and the air filled with the stench of gunpowder and death. Each shot left the city trembling. Entire sections of wall crumbled, towers cracked, and the once impregnable defenses began to bleed. The citizens watched in terror as centuries of divine protection shattered in days. Priests carried icons along the battlements, praying for miracles while masons worked feverishly to repair the damage, shoving stones and timbers into the gaps as if mortal hands could mend a dying legend. Inside Hagia Sophia, the chants of monks echoed louder than ever, rising to the dome like smoke. "Lord, deliver us from the enemy," they cried, but even their voices were drowned out by the booming rhythm of the cannon outside, the heartbeat of a new era. The defenders were brave, but bravery could not stop progress. For every crack they patched, Mehmed's artillery tore open 2 more. The Ottomans had mastered the future. The Byzantines were clinging to the past. The walls that had once defined the empire now became its tombstone. Still, they fought. Night after night, the defenders launched counterattacks, burning Ottoman siege towers, ambushing sappers, and praying that dawn might never come. Yet dawn always came, and with it, the relentless pounding of Basilica. The myth of invincibility had ended. The Theodosian walls, once the pride of emperors and the terror of kings, were crumbling beneath the weight of destiny and iron. The birth of the monster cannon was not just an act of engineering, it was an act of prophecy. Urban, the Hungarian metallurgist, had once offered his services to the Byzantines. He came to Emperor Constantine V, promising to forge a weapon that could shake the heavens. But the emperor, broke and desperate, could not afford him. So Urban turned to the Sultan instead. Mehmed listened and gave him gold, iron, and men enough to build a machine that would alter the course of history. In the fields of Edirne, the great cannon took shape, a monstrous serpent of bronze 30 feet long its barrel wide enough for a man to crawl through. Urban's forge burned day and night. Sparks flew like fireflies across the sky as molten metal poured into the mold. When it cooled, the ground cracked beneath its weight. The weapon had to be pulled by 60 oxen and 200 men across the Thracian plain to reach Constantinople. Villagers who saw it whispered that it was not a cannon, but a dragon, the beast of Revelation come to devour the city of God. When the cannon first roared, the earth itself seemed to scream. The shockwave rattled every bone within the walls. People fell to their knees, believing the last judgment had come. The stone ball it hurled weighed nearly half a ton and tore through the outer defenses like paper. Dust rose into the sky as screams echoed from the battlements. Soldiers who had once mocked the new weapons of the West now prayed for deliverance from them. Mehmed stood beside the cannon, eyes fixed on the city that had haunted the dreams of sultans for generations. "Behold," he said to his commanders, "the gate of Rome shall open to Islam." His words were swallowed by the next blast. The thunder rolled across the Bosporus, shaking even the ships anchored in the Golden Horn. Inside Constantinople, panic spread like fire. The defenders rushed to repair the breaches. Priests marched through the streets chanting, "God will not abandon his city." But faith trembled under the echo of each explosion. Urban's creation was relentless, its rhythm steady as a heartbeat, and each pulse meant another crack in the walls, another piece of the empire dying. The monster cannon was more than a weapon. It was a message that the age of castles and divine walls was over, and the age of fire had begun. The people of Constantinople no longer looked to the horizon with hope. They looked to it in fear, waiting for the next roar, the next tremor, the next piece of heaven to fall. What would you have felt hearing that first blast? Awe, terror, or despair? Tell me in the comments. As the siege dragged into its second month, the city began to devour itself. What the cannon could not destroy, starvation and sickness finished. Constantinople, once the jewel of the world, now stank of decay. The air hung heavy with the smell of death, a mixture of smoke, unwashed bodies, and the rot of corpses buried too shallow in the earth. The markets were empty. Bread had become rarer than gold. The last sacks of grain were rationed by the emperor himself, handed out to soldiers and priests, while common families boiled leather, grass, and even rats to survive. Mothers wept as their children wasted away before their eyes, their small hands reaching out for food that no longer existed. Disease crept through the alleys like a ghost. Dysentery, fever, and infection claimed more lives than the enemy's cannonballs. The sick were left, in corners of abandoned houses, praying for mercy or for death. The priests moved among them, offering blessings and last rites in equal measure. Every sunrise brought more bodies to carry, more graves to dig, and less strength to do either. Yet, amidst this horror, faith endured. Hagia Sophia became both a sanctuary and a tomb. Its marble floors were covered in sleeping bodies, women clutching icons, soldiers sharpening broken swords, monks chanting psalms that trembled beneath the dome. At night, the candlelight reflected off the golden mosaics, casting the faces of saints across the dying faithful. It was as if heaven itself watched and wept. Emperor Constantine XV walked among his people without crown or escort. He offered words of courage, though his eyes betrayed the truth, that he knew the end was near. "We are the last," he told his commanders, "and there will be no more after us." Still, he refused to surrender. The walls continued to crumble. The cannons roared without rest. Yet within those crumbling stones, something unbreakable survived, not the empire's power, but its soul. Even as men starved, they sang hymns. Even as the streets filled with the dead, the bells of Hagia Sophia continued to toll. It was defiance through faith, a final stand not against Mehmed's army, but against oblivion itself. For those who lived through those final days, hunger became holiness, and suffering became salvation. To endure was to honor the city. To breathe was to resist. And so they endured, not for victory, but for memory. No empire ever dies cleanly. It rots from within first, long before the enemy ever breaches its walls. As the siege entered its final weeks, the defenses of Constantinople did not merely crumble under cannon fire. They collapsed under the weight of betrayal. It was not the Ottomans' power alone that doomed the city, but whispers, whispered deals, whispered fears, whispered prayers turned to silence. Among the defenders, distrust festered like disease. The Genoese mercenaries, led by Giovanni Giustiniani, were brave men, yet mercenaries fight for coin, not for God. The emperor had trusted them to hold the walls near the gate of St. Romanus, the most vulnerable point of all. But as ammunition ran low and morale broke, arguments erupted between the Greeks and their foreign allies. Each side accused the other of cowardice. The unity that once held the city together dissolved into suspicion and resentment. Rumors spread that secret envoys had slipped through the Ottoman lines carrying messages of surrender. Some said the Venetians were ready to abandon the city. Others whispered that a noble family had already opened one of the smaller gates in exchange for safety. No one knew what was true, and that uncertainty was poison. In the dead of night, under the flickering torchlight, Emperor Constantine V stood on the walls, staring out at the endless sea of Ottoman tents. The city below him was dying, but still he held his ground. He had been betrayed by allies, abandoned by the West, and yet his oath remained unbroken, to defend the Queen of Cities until his final breath. Inside the walls, chaos spread. Supplies vanished. Commanders argued. The wounded filled the streets, begging for mercy that no one could give. The once disciplined Byzantine army had become a patchwork of desperation. Greek archers, Italian gunners, monks carrying spears, children running messages between towers that would soon fall. Then came the moment that sealed their fate. During a fierce Ottoman bombardment, a section of the walls near the Kirkaporta gate, long forgotten and rarely guarded, was left open after a repair crew fled. The small gate, meant only for patrols, became the unholy door through which destiny entered. When the first Ottoman soldiers slipped through the breach, the defenders didn't even realize it. By the time the alarm spread, it was too late. Panic tore through the city like wildfire. Giustiniani, the commander of the Genoese, was struck by a cannon fragment and gravely wounded. His men, believing him dead, abandoned their posts and fled to the ships. The line broke. The walls fell. It was not strength that conquered Constantinople. It was fear. It was not Mehmed's cannon that shattered the empire. It was the quiet sound of trust breaking in the night. And as the dawn rose on May 29, 1453, the city's fate was sealed, not by thunder, but by silence. The dawn that rose over Constantinople on May 29, 1453 was no ordinary dawn. It was the beginning of a silence so deep that even the sea seemed to hold its breath. The bells of Hagia Sophia rang for the last time as the Ottomans breached the walls. The defenders, outnumbered and exhausted, met the flood with the ferocity of men who knew they were already ghosts. The streets became rivers of blood. The first to die were those who fought, soldiers cut down in alleys, priests slaughtered on the steps of their churches. The rest came soon, after. No one was spared. Men were butchered, women and children dragged away in chains, their screams echoing through the marble corridors where emperors had once walked. Emperor Constantine XIII disappeared in the chaos. Some said he fell fighting near the gate of St. Romanus, his body buried beneath the tide of the dead. Others swore he turned to stone and waits still beneath the ruins, to rise again when the city is free. But in truth, his death was too human for legend. He fought until his sword broke, and then with his hands, until he was swallowed by the tide. The Ottomans poured into the city like a storm unleashed. Their victory was absolute, yet it was not triumph they carried. It was frenzy. For 3 days, Constantinople was not a city, but a wound. The great Hagia Sophia, once the holiest temple of Christendom, became a place of horror. Thousands sought refuge within its walls, clinging to icons, crying out for mercy. When the soldiers entered, the prayers turned to screams. The sacred altar was overturned, the relics shattered, and the floor stained forever. Outside, the streets burned. Palaces, libraries, and monasteries, the treasures of 1,000 years, went up in flames. The knowledge of the ancient world, preserved through centuries of darkness, vanished in a single night of fire. When the smoke cleared, the queen of cities was gone. Only ashes remained, and the sound of weeping. Mehmed entered Hagia Sophia on horseback, dismounted before the shattered altar and bowed to the ground. "There is no God but God," he said, his voice echoing beneath the dome. It was both a prayer and a declaration that an empire had died, and another had been born. The survivors were herded into slavery, the wounded left to rot where they fell. And yet, even as the city burned, a strange silence lingered, not of peace, but of exhaustion. Constantinople had bled enough to fill the sea, and the sea itself seemed to mourn. Tell me in the comments if you had been there, witnessing the fall of 1,000 years in a single day. What would have broken first? Your faith or your heart? Victory can turn men into beasts. What followed the fall of Constantinople was not conquest. It was delirium. The Ottoman soldiers, drunk on blood and triumph, unleashed chaos upon the city that had defied empires for 1,000 years. For 3 days the conquerors were given free rein. The laws of God and man ceased to exist. What had been the most sacred city in Christendom became a carnival of horror. Soldiers tore open the doors of churches, monasteries, and palaces, ripping treasures from altars and corpses alike. Gold and relics, silks and icons, everything that centuries of faith had built was stripped bare in hours. The Hagia Sophia, once the holiest cathedral of the empire, became a stage for sacrilege. The marble floor was slick with blood, the icons shattered, the altar defiled. Women were dragged screaming through its doors. Children clung to the legs of soldiers who laughed as they kicked them aside. The echo of hymns was replaced by cries of agony and the clatter of armor against stone. The same walls that had once reflected divine light now reflected only madness. The libraries burned. Scrolls and manuscripts, works of philosophy, science, and theology, vanished into smoke. What the fire didn't consume, greed did. Priceless texts were torn apart for the gold leaf in their bindings. The accumulated wisdom of Rome, Greece, and Byzantium turned to ash. In the streets, the dead lay piled like offerings to vengeance. Churches became stables. Noble women were paraded in chains. The very symbols of the empire, its banners, its crosses, its emperors' thrones, were trampled into dust beneath foreign boots. And yet, even among the conquerors, there were those who hesitated. Some soldiers, seeing the horror, wept. Others turned away. The young sultan himself rode through the ruins in silence. He had dreamed of capturing Constantinople, but not of inheriting a corpse. As he passed through the city, the smell of smoke and rot clung to his cloak. He looked upon the broken domes, the blood-soaked stones, and murmured words that history remembers. What a city we have given to ruin. But remorse could not resurrect the dead. Constantinople's glory was gone, buried beneath the ashes of its own magnificence. The empire had not merely fallen, it had been unmade, desecrated, and consumed by the hunger of its conquerors. In that moment, civilization itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the world too could not believe what it had just allowed to happen. When the smoke lifted over the Bosporus, the world was no longer the same. The city that had once called itself the Second Rome lay silent beneath a new banner, the crescent moon of the Ottoman Empire. The Byzantines, heirs to Caesar and Constantine, had vanished like ghosts, What remained were ashes, silence, and the echo of 1,000 years coming to an end. For nearly 11 centuries, Constantinople had stood as the bridge between worlds, where East met West, where Greek met Latin, where faith met empire. It had survived plague, siege, and schism. It had outlasted kings, crusaders, and caliphs. But now its walls were broken, its streets empty, and its legacy scattered to the winds. In the ruins of the Blachernay Palace, the last imperial banners lay trampled and blood-stained. The throne of emperors who had once ruled the known world was now just a splintered chair beneath the open sky. The mosaics that had glimmered with divine gold now reflected only ruin. The great libraries were gone. The scholars who had preserved the wisdom of the ancients were dead or enslaved. Yet even as the empire's body perished, its spirit refused to die. Across the sea, refugees carried with them fragments of its light, manuscripts, icons, and knowledge that would soon ignite the Renaissance in the West. What Constantinople lost in stone, it left behind in memory, an inheritance of thought, art, and faith that could not be conquered by cannon or sword. For Mehmed II, victory was absolute. He entered his new capital and ordered the restoration of Hagia Sophia as a mosque. The muezzin's call replaced the Christian bell, echoing through the domes that had once sung with choirs. To the Ottomans, this was the dawn of a new age. To the West, it was the death of an old one. The Pope in Rome wept when he heard the news. In Venice and Genoa, traders spoke in hushed tones, for the gateway to the east was now closed. Monarchs across Europe saw the shadow of the crescent stretching across their maps and wondered how long before it swallowed them too. And yet, somewhere within those same ruins, hope still flickered. The Byzantines had believed themselves eternal, and in a way, they were. Their faith, their art, their words, they survived in the hearts of those who refused to forget. The fall of Constantinople was not just the end of an empire. It was the end of an age, the last breath of the ancient world, giving way to the fire of the modern one. The sound of those collapsing walls still echoes through time, a reminder that even the greatest civilizations can fall, and that from their ashes, the world begins anew. Long after the fires died, the scar of Constantinople remained, not only on the stones of the city, but on the conscience of mankind. The fall of the Queen of Cities was not merely a historical event. It was a fracture in time. It marked the death of the medieval world and the birth of the modern one, a wound that never truly healed. The Ottomans rebuilt what they had conquered. Under Mehmed II, Constantinople became Istanbul, the new heart of an empire that would stretch across 3 continents. The mosques rose where churches once stood, and new life filled the shattered streets. Yet beneath every brick of that reborn city, the ghosts of Byzantium whispered. The marble columns and mosaics of Hagia Sophia still bore the fingerprints of the old world, as if history itself refused to let go. In Europe, the fall sent shock waves that reshaped destiny. The fear of Ottoman expansion drove kings to unite, to explore new lands, to seek new routes to the east. Within a generation, the world would see the sails of Columbus and the cannons of the conquistadors, the direct children of Constantinople's fall. What had died in one world was reborn in another, fiercer and hungrier. But for those who loved the city, who called her the mother of churches, her loss was personal, a divine betrayal. Pilgrims who visited centuries later spoke of the air still thick with sorrow, of the echoes that lingered in the stones. Some said that on quiet nights, when the wind swept through the Bosporus, they could still hear the faint toll of the bells of Hagia Sophia, ringing for a world that no longer existed. The fall of Constantinople is more than history. It is a warning. No empire is eternal, no civilization invincible. Power fades, faith wavers, and glory always demands its price. The city's story reminds us that what we build from pride will one day crumble into dust. But what we build from memory endures. And now, the question remains, What legacy will our age leave behind? If you've made it this far, thank you for journeying through one of the darkest and most defining moments in human history. Leave a comment below with the phrase, "The city still remembers." It lets me know you've seen the truth beneath the ruins. Make sure to subscribe because in the next video, we'll uncover another buried secret of the ancient world, one that will change the way you see history forever.